Okay? There was no thought that oh, if we stop now, the next 50 people we treat will magically get better. There wasn't. They knew the trial at best would go from harmful to negative, but they stopped the trials early. So you don't get to call a timeout during the football game when you're losing terribly in the second quarter and then say, oh, okay, yeah, you were up by 10 points, but we were just really losing badly. We'll just say that we're only going to count that two quarter. You have to play the whole game and find out exactly how badly the Patriots were going to beat the Colts. And it's terrible to watch. Deflategate's real. So myth number 2, the Lazarus effect. Let's talk about that. So everyone has this story, and this is really why I believe that the neurology folks are so into TPA, is because they've seen it work, or at least they think they've seen it work. Okay? Neurologists are not bad people. Okay? They really aren't. Okay? I don't want to demonize them at all. They have seen, I gave the medicine, and then an hour or two later, they felt better. Okay? And that is really hard for us to ignore. Okay? We have treatments that we treat the same way. How many times have you given that liter of fluid and the person just felt better and you're like, that was me. Yeah. I gave that liter of fluid, I fixed everything. In reality, they may have been getting better anyway, and you just happen to be around. So the problem with this is that there's no data that shows this exists at all. In fact, the most robust data for it is actually, 3 to 6 months from now, you're less likely to be disabled. Not 2 hours or 4 hours or even 24 hours where any theoretical Lazarus effect could have been picked up on. Every time they've looked close to when you actually gave the drug, it didn't help. Okay, the one trial that actually had an early outcome, NINS-1, at 24 hours was robustly negative, not even close to positive. Okay, so the Lazarus effect exists in the hearts and minds of people that have seen it work, but they don't have any data whatsoever to show it. Okay, and if they actually get better that quickly, it's more likely that it's a stroke mimic or a TIA than it is for it to actually be a true ischemic stroke that should have gotten lytics in the first place. 10 points for whoever can identify the Joseph DeCreux song here. I get knocked down, but I get up again. Thank you. So there's the Lazarus bias, okay? So we like to claim responsibility because it's really uncomfortable for us to say, you know what, I gave that drug and it didn't work. Hindsight bias, I knew it all along. I knew that this drug would work all along. We just had all these negative studies. We're just going to ignore them. And then there's also the belief bias, because it makes sense that if we unclog this vessel, then suddenly the person will get better. It's kind of like a plumbing analogy of neurology. Yeah, if we just open the pipe, things will get better. It just isn't true. So let's talk about the consistent benefit. So there's the big 3, okay? These are the 3 that everyone likes to talk about. NINS-2, ECASS-III, IST-3. No accident that none of these were NINS-1, ECASS-1 or 2, or IST-1 or 2, which we're actually looking at different issues. So, Monty Python time, all right? The Black Knight emerges. So NINS-2. So they basically lump people into Rankin 0, 1, and 2. It's basically just a disability score. You don't need to worry about it, okay? It turns out that the number one factor that determines how bad you're going to do after a stroke is how bad your stroke is. This sounds trivial, but it gets forgotten, okay? If you have a massive stroke, okay, you come in and you're not even able to talk, you can't move one half of your body, it doesn't matter if I have a really, really great treatment or not, you're going to do poorly the vast majority of the time. If you come in and you are having a really tiny stroke, you maybe have a little bitty bit of facial droop, maybe just a little bit of limb weakness, but everything else is fine, you're going to do fantastic because you're already doing well, okay? Even if I gave you nothing, if I rubbed some capsaicin cream on your forehead and said that was my treatment, you would do great because you're not having a large stroke. So the most important thing out of all this is how bad was it to begin with, okay? And it turns out that in this study, not because the people doing the study were bad people, but just statistically, it turns out that a vast majority of terrible strokes were happening in the placebo group, so that they were not starting off as well, okay? So, and I don't want to get paranoid, but the reason that they changed this, okay, because they actually changed it from their initial plan of how they were going to report the data, was because this was funded by Genentech, the maker of TPA, okay? So they would not release their data, even though there was a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that went on for many, many years. Jerry Hoffman, the guy that's behind the nexus criteria that we use to clear C-spines, fought for years in court to make them release the data because they refused to. And it's because they knew that once people actually looked at the actual patient data, their study, which is the entire basis for why they were giving TPA for many, many years, because it was the only one that was positive before ECASS-III, the only reason that they had that was because they would not release the data. So what happens when you actually release the data and then let someone else crunch the numbers? Well, it turns out it's kind of sad, because this is what their study originally said. Originally, their study was not, do you fall into 0, 1, or 2 ranking? It was, what is your change in ranking after 6 months? Okay? Now that seems like a small difference, but what happens is if you have a worse stroke, your change in ranking scale matters a lot, because you could go from a ranking 4 to a ranking 2, okay? But if you're just saying like, oh, well, when we stop, who's got ranking 0, 1, or 2? Like, who's doing pretty well? Well, that was robustly positive. They had a very positive result with that because they changed their primary outcome, not because their study actually worked. So what they did here was actually looked over the 90 days of the study. They actually looked at what the curve was for whether you would get better or worse, okay? And statistically speaking, these are exactly the same. Whether you got lytics or not, they are exactly the same. If lytics worked, you would see a large separation of those blue and green lines showing the treatment benefit of lytics, okay? And it didn't happen, okay? And the reason it didn't happen was this corrects for the fact that the people that were getting placebo were sicker to begin with. So there's no way that they're going to get better as quickly as the people that weren't that sick. Okay, and it's entirely because they changed their primary outcome. So this is the best case scenario per AAEM using this study, and it's wrong because it doesn't correct for that. Okay, so what they did here was something called data dredging, where you do a study, you don't like the results, and you just move the goalposts. You just say, you know what, that Georgia Tech game did not go well last year for me. I don't want to look at the number of points. I want to look at the total number of rushing yards or something like that, and saying, oh, look, we had more rushing yards. Which actually I don't think was true that game. Sorry. More passing yards. We got you on that one. Sorry, Matt. But you can't do that. You say, hey, look, when we started this game, we said who can score the most points, not who had the most passing yards. Okay? So you're data dredging, okay, which at best is something to do a hypothesis generation from. So you could take this study and say, look, I don't actually want to look at the change from your ranking scale. I want to look at who gets to 0, 1, or 2. We're going to do a new trial and randomize folks. And that's totally scientifically legit, and you can do that. They didn't do that. They just basically made up the data. So the other problem is that the people actually running the numbers was Genentech, which is funny because the drug company actually basically wrote the paper for them. There were some errors in calculations that showed the infarct size that was larger than the head of the patient. They said that the volume of brain that was ischemic was actually larger than a human's head. Right? I could name certain people that may have had a head large enough to where they could have had a stroke that size, but I'm not going to because that would be a low blow, and he's not here. And they fought this Freedom of Information Act, okay? Which if you had a good study and you know it worked, you'd be like, look, here's the data. Enjoy. It's but a scratch. So ECASS-III, this is my favorite of the positive trials, okay? When people do good literature, you should give them props, okay? And they did a pretty good job. Now, the problem is that they barely eked it out, okay? Their confidence interval went to 1.02, as Jim pointed out, okay? Which means that the 95% confidence interval is barely positive, okay? But it looks like it was positive, okay? Now, one thing that was curious about this is they actually excluded severe strokes, which are the very folks that we're most focused on, okay? So it's kind of quirky that they did this, okay? So, yeah, this is not bad, not bad. But wait, they actually put in their protocol before they did the study that if we see any difference between the two groups, because they saw what happened in NINS-2 and they wanted to correct for it, that if there is a statistically significant difference between those two groups when they start, we're going to do a statistical correction, okay? Which is totally scientifically valid. You could say if we randomly get more people with diabetes, and it turns out that diabetes is really relevant for how these folks do, we're going to correct for it so that we don't have to do the bend over backwards thing that they had to do for NINS-2, okay? And so they said, yeah, if it gets down below 0.004, then it was randomly biased in one group, and so we're going to correct for it. And it turns out that they just screwed up the math. And whether it was intentional or unintentional, I don't know, but they listed it as 0.03 when if you calculate it, it's 0.003, okay? Which means that if you actually corrected for it, because this was a significant factor about whether you had a prior stroke, because it turns out if you're presenting with more than one stroke, you're more likely to have future strokes, and you're more likely to already be disabled because of your prior strokes. So if you correct it, now the new odds ratio is actually 0.89 to 1.59, making this too a negative study. So I don't think that there was any problem with what they were doing. I think that they had good intentions, but they screwed up their numbers. And when someone double-checked their work, found out that if they did the study the way they were supposed to, it's actually a negative study. And this is the absolute best piece of evidence that they have to support it. Okay?
Did they put out a response to that?
No. No, this was a little bit of the, I'm sure it was more scientific than that, but no, they never stated why it was that they didn't correct the way they were supposed to, much to the chagrin of quite a few naysayers. It's just a flesh wound. So IST-III, this was the largest of these studies, and I use study in a loose way because there are comedic errors in the way that they did this thing. That took what could have been a huge opportunity to really answer this question and instead made it a joke, okay? So IST-III has the worst moving of the goalposts ever. They running out of time to recruit patients, and so they basically said, no, we're completely abandoning not only what we said our primary outcome was going to be, we're pulling out something that wasn't even a secondary outcome. We're just totally making something up. And they conned an Irish statistician to be like, yeah, that sounds good, I bless it. And then they published their paper as positive. So we'll show you how they did that in a second. So you don't get to change your primary outcome. Like Highlander, there can only be one, okay? It's because it's a primary. And this sounds basic, but I get sick and tired of reading papers where it's like, well, of the 3 primary outcomes, no, you get one. It's primary. Everything else is secondary. Seems basic, but they just screw it up. So this is how you prevent data dredging, okay? Secondary outcomes are great, and you can talk about it and say, hey, someone should do a study. Turns out that diabetics are different, and they should get different treatment. That's great. All you're doing is generating a hypothesis, not proving anything, okay? So what they used was something called the Oxford Handicap score. Very similar to the Rankin scores. You don't really need to know the details. The lower your number, the better off you are, okay? So, this morning I haven't had a lot of coffee yet, so I'm around a 1 right now. But, if I get my coffee, I get down to a 0, okay? And then 5 is terrible, terrible sadness. So this is IST at 6 months. And this is what was supposedly like this huge change. And if you look at it, it's really pretty close, okay? So the problem is that when they completely made up this ordinal analysis, they decided where to draw the line. And it turns out that there are several ways that you could divide this up. You could say, all right, our outcome is 0 versus 1 through 6, or 0 and 1 through 2 through 6, or 0, 1, and 2 versus 3 through 6, and so forth. You could slice that pie more than one way. Turns out the only way, even in this disastrously poorly done study, that you get a statistically positive outcome is the way that they did it at 0, 1, and 2. Because I crunched the numbers, and every other way fails. Every other way. If you slice it there, it doesn't work. There, it doesn't work. Here, does work, got reported, doesn't work, doesn't work, doesn't work. I don't think that was a coincidence, okay? I just really don't. So that's what they did. And they just made up this and recruited a statistician to bless it. The other part, and this is the really fun part for me, is the study started off as a blinded randomized controlled trial and looked like it was going to be awesome because it was literally going to get thousands of patients in a randomized controlled trial to see whether placebo versus TPA worked. And this was going to be the show ender, okay? Because it was going to have 10 times as many patients as what NINDS-2 did. This was going to shut up the critics and make guys like me just stop talking about it, okay? So they did a blinded portion for about 300 patients. And there was actually a trend towards statistical significance of harm from TPA. And they stopped. And the reason they stopped, they say, is Genentech had gotten approval for people to be given it to at least 4.5 hours and consider it up to 6. They had been given approval in some jurisdictions for that. And so they pulled the drug. Genentech stopped giving them the $2,000 a dose drug. And so the study authors could no longer afford to do their study. And they had thousands of remaining patients to recruit, and thousands times thousands turns out to be millions, and they couldn't afford to do it. Okay? So we went from the blinded section, which was robustly negative, almost statistical significance that it was harmful in that first 300 folks, which is about the same number of people as what they had in the entire NINDS trial. Then you look at the unblinded portion, and it actually somehow becomes positive, and things get better. Why is that? Well, turns out placebo is the thing, y'all. And the amazing part of this